Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind that softened edges and muffled sound, turning St. Aldwyn's Close into a picture-book lane. The houses faced one another in polite, brick-built harmony, wreaths on doors, candles glowing in windows. Inside number 4, the scent of spice and citrus hung thick in the air, the last warmth of Christmas Day lingering around the dining table where crumbs of pastry and a half-empty decanter of port bore witness to a meal now finished. It was there, in the narrow sitting-room beyond, that Colonel Arthur Pembroke died. He was found just after 8 o'clock, slumped in his armchair by the fire, a tartan rug neatly folded over his knees. His expression was not contorted by pain but fixed in mild surprise, as though interrupted mid-thought. The wireless murmured on, having long since moved from carols to the shipping forecast. On the side table, balanced on a china saucer patterned with holly leaves, lay the remains of a mince pie, 2 bites taken, the rest untouched. Dr. Finch, summoned from the neighbouring village despite the worsening weather, pronounced death within minutes of arrival. Heart failure, he said at first, more by habit than certainty, but a faint bitter almond smell made him pause. He bent closer, sniffed again, and frowned. No, he murmured, that's not right at all. The word poison passed quietly from mouth to mouth, shocking in its intimacy. Poison belonged to foreign intrigues and penny dreadfuls, not to St. Aldwyn's Close, where people borrowed cups of sugar and argued over hedges. Yet the evidence was stubborn. Colonel Pembroke had been hale that morning, brisk enough to walk to church through the frost. Now he was dead, and the mince pie sat between innocence and accusation. The house itself seemed to resist the notion of foul play. The front door had been bolted from the inside, the key still in the lock. Windows were closed against the cold, fastened tight. No signs of struggle marred the room. Nothing was missing. If someone had come to murder the Colonel, they had done so with the utmost courtesy, leaving everything precisely as they found it. The guests were few and familiar. Mrs. Lavender, Pembroke's widowed sister, had been staying since the week before Christmas, her nerves fragile and her voice perpetually trembling. Basil Grant, a second cousin down on his luck, had arrived that afternoon, hoping, so he said, for goodwill and perhaps a small loan. Mrs. Hargreaves from next door had joined them for tea, bringing with her a tin of homemade mince pies wrapped in festive paper. The Colonel's housekeeper, Mrs. Pollock, had served and cleared, her movements as efficient and unobtrusive as always. All denied any quarrel, all professed affection. None could explain how poison had entered a pie eaten in a locked room. The mince pies themselves became the centre of attention. Mrs. Hargreaves insisted she had baked them that very morning, using a recipe handed down from her mother. She had eaten one herself, at home, and suffered no ill effects. Mrs. Pollock confirmed that the Colonel had taken only a single pie, refusing seconds with a laugh about indulgence. The rest of the tin, now counted and recounted, showed nothing amiss. No strange taste, no discoloration, no missing pie. And yet one man was dead. Inspector Slack arrived late, stamping snow from his boots and shedding impatience with his coat. He examined the room, the locks, the windows, the pie. He questioned each person in turn, his notebook filling with statements that contradicted nothing and explained even less. If this was murder, he said finally, then it was done by someone already in the house, with something already here. But why a mince pie? And how? The unusual clue presented itself almost by accident. While Mrs. Pollock poured tea for the shaken household, her hand slipped and a spoon clattered to the floor. As she stooped to retrieve it, Inspector Slack noticed a faint smudge on the saucer that had held the fatal pie, a greasy mark, as though something had been brushed aside. On closer inspection, there was a barely visible indentation in the pastry crumbs, not round like a bite, but narrow and straight. "Looks like a pin mark," Slack muttered. No pins were found on the table, no needles, no reason why a pin should be anywhere near a mince pie on Christmas Day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing the house in silence. Inside, suspicion began to creep, quiet and insidious. The crime was at once absurd and terrifying. A poisoned mince pie in a locked room, a murder that wore the mask of festive cheer. It seemed insoluble, a puzzle without edges to grip. And somewhere in St. Aldwyn's Close, though no one yet thought to look. An elderly lady with bright eyes and an unassuming manner was already fitting the pieces together in her mind, the taste of Christmas spice reminding her of something she had seen long ago and never forgotten. By the time the police car's engine faded into the snowy distance, the house had settled into an uneasy quiet. Inspector Slack had insisted everyone remain available for further questioning, but with the roads worsening, he postponed anything more thorough until morning. The colonel's body was left where it lay. A small mercy, he said, as though moving it might disturb the delicate balance of whatever puzzle confronted them. Mrs. Lavender retired to her room in tears. Basil Grant hovered awkwardly by the window as if measuring his chances of escape, and Mrs. Pollock busied herself with unnecessary tidying, the clink of china unnaturally loud in the stillness. It was then that Miss Jane Marple arrived. No one had thought to summon her. She came of her own accord, wrapped in a sensible coat and scarf, tapping the snow from her boots with brisk efficiency. Miss Marple lived 3 houses down, and though she had declined the colonel's invitation to Christmas tea due to a touch of rheumatism, news travelled quickly in St. Aldwyn's Close. A policeman's visit, lights flashing against falling snow, was not easily ignored. "My dear Mrs. Pollock," Miss Marple said gently, stepping into the sitting-room as though invited. "Such dreadful weather to be standing about in the hall. I thought you might appreciate another pair of eyes, even if only to make sure nothing else goes amiss." Mrs. Pollock hesitated, then nodded. There was something comforting in Miss Marple's presence, her mild voice, her knitting bag tucked under one arm, as if she had merely stepped out for a neighbourly call. She looked, at first glance, like the last person to be of any help at all. Miss Marple did not approach the body immediately. Instead, she paused by the fireplace, taking in the arrangement of the room. Her gaze lingered on the armchair, the folded rug, the wireless still murmuring faintly. She noted the mince pie saucer, now carefully covered with a napkin, and the plate of remaining pies set aside on the sideboard. "How very neat everything is," she remarked. "Colonel Pembroke always did like things just so, didn't he?" "Yes, miss," Mrs. Pollock replied. "He couldn't abide clutter." "No, quite," said Miss Marple, "which makes one wonder why that little tin was placed there." She pointed with her umbrella tip to a small, empty decorative tin near the window, its lid resting beside it. "It seems rather out of keeping." Mrs. Pollock frowned. "That's Mrs. Hargreaves's. She brought the pies in it." "Ah, of course. But she normally favours the larger tins, doesn't she? The blue. One with the dented corner? I've borrowed it myself on occasion." Mrs. Pollock looked startled. Well, perhaps she used a different one this time." Miss Marple smiled and moved closer to the side table. She lifted the napkin from the saucer, peering at the crumbs with keen interest. "Inspector Slack mentioned a mark here, I believe. Very observant of him. Still, I wonder if he considered what might have made it—" She reached into her bag and produced a small magnifying glass. It hovered briefly over the saucer, then over the remaining pies. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the sideboard, where a small sewing basket had been placed, its contents hastily tidied away. "Mrs. Pollock," she said lightly, "do you do much mending in the evenings?" "Only when needed," the housekeeper replied. "Buttons and such. And do you keep your pins in that basket?" "Yes, miss." Miss Marple nodded, as though confirming something to herself. She turned as footsteps approached and found Basil Grant lingering in the doorway. He attempted a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Terrible business," he said. "Never thought I'd see the old man like that." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Death often surprises us. Tell me, Mr. Grant, you were sitting here when the colonel ate his pie?" "Yes. We were talking about family matters, of course. And you didn't notice anything unusual? A taste, perhaps? A comment?" Basil hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "No." He said it was good. "Very good." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression kind. How fortunate. And yet he didn't finish it. Curious, isn't it? Basil shifted his weight. He was never one to overeat. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though I recall him once finishing 3 at the church fete and asking for a 4th. The room seemed to grow colder." Miss Marple looked around once more, taking in the sewing basket, the empty tin, the untouched pies. She said nothing further, merely replacing her magnifying glass and settling into a chair with her knitting, needles clicking softly. To anyone watching, she appeared to be doing very little at all, But beneath the gentle rhythm of wool and steel, Miss Marple's mind was busy, noting small inconsistencies, fleeting reactions, and the peculiar intimacy of poison chosen to masquerade as kindness. The first threads of deception had begun to show, and she intended to follow them, stitch by careful stitch, until the pattern revealed itself. Morning light crept reluctantly into the sitting room, thin and grey, filtered through snow-laden branches. Miss Marple had been awake for hours, her knitting finished and folded away, her mind quietly rehearsing the previous evening. Inspector Slack returned shortly after 9, stamping snow from his boots once more, bringing with him an air of official purpose and faint irritation at finding Miss Marple already installed as though she belonged there. "Well," he said, glancing around, "let's get on with it, one at a time." They began with Mrs. Hargreaves, who arrived flustered and red-cheeked, her hat askew. She clasped her handbag as if it were a shield. Her account flowed quickly, too quickly, every detail polished smooth. She had baked the pies alone, she insisted. No one else had entered her kitchen. She had tasted one herself, twice in fact, and found it delicious. When asked about the tin, she frowned. "That old thing," she said. "I simply grabbed what was at hand." "I don't see how that matters." Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, looked up. "You're usually very particular, dear," she said mildly. "You once refused to lend me a teaspoon because it didn't match the set." Mrs. Hargreaves flushed. "Well, one can't be expected to remember everything at a time like this." Inspector Slack made a note. Basil Gras, N.T., was next. He adopted a tone of wounded cooperation, sighing heavily as though the process itself were an affront. He spoke of his affection for his cousin, of hopes unfulfilled, of small disappointments brushed aside with forced good humour. He confirmed once more that the Colonel had enjoyed the pie. "You're quite sure he didn't say anything else?" Miss Marple asked. Basil's smile tightened. "Quite sure. And yet you hesitated yesterday," she said gently. He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Did I? Nerves, I expect. Anyone would be nervous." Inspector Slack watched him closely now. Mrs. Lavender wept throughout her questioning, her words broken by sobs that seemed almost rehearsed in their timing. She spoke of her brother's kindness, of her reliance upon him, of how dreadful it would be to lose him, particularly now, with her own finances in such disorder. When asked where she had been at the time of death, she dabbed her eyes. "In my room, resting. I felt faint after tea." "And you heard nothing?" Miss Marple asked. "Nothing at all," Mrs. Lavender said quickly. "The walls are very thick." Miss Marple thought of the wireless murmuring in the next room, easily audible even with the door closed. Finally, Mrs. Pollock sat down, hands folded in her lap, back straight. Her answers were concise, unembellished. She had served the tea, cleared the plates, tidied the room. She had noticed nothing unusual. "You didn't see anyone approach the Colonel after tea?" Inspector Slack asked. "No, sir." "And the sewing basket?" Miss Marple prompted. "Had you been using it that afternoon?" Mrs. Pollock hesitated. "Just a moment, but it was there. I mended a cushion earlier," she said. "Put it away before tea." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft. "Of course." As the questions ended, a strange atmosphere settled over the room. Each account, taken alone, seemed plausible. Together, they four made something uneven, a pattern with threads pulled too tight in places and left loose in others. Miss Marple felt it keenly, the way one feels a wrong stitch beneath the fingers. What struck her most was not what had been said, but how. Mrs. Hargreaves's eagerness to explain every triviality, Basil Grant's insistence on cheer, Mrs. Lavender's convenient frailty, and Mrs. Pollock's careful restraint, as though guarding something fragile and easily broken. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. "We'll have the pies analysed," he said. "The tin, too. Until then—" "Until then," Miss Marple echoed, "you might consider how very intimate poison is. It requires time, opportunity, and a certain confidence." Slack looked at her sharply. "You have something in mind, Miss Marple?" "Only impressions," she said, smiling faintly. "And impressions, like stitches, may seem small, but enough of them together can unravel quite a thing." Outside, the snow began to melt, dripping steadily from the eaves. Inside, beneath the polite surfaces and practised words, motive stirred, quiet resentments, hidden needs, and a carefully placed act of kindness that had turned deadly. Miss Marple felt certain now that someone in that room had spoken very carefully indeed, and that the truth lay not in what they offered freely, but in what they had taken pains to conceal. The sitting-room grew quieter after Inspector Slack stepped outside to make a call, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. She gazed into the dying fire, considering not the act itself, but the reasons that might have led to it. In her experience, murder was rarely a matter of sudden impulse. It was far more often the end of a long, carefully hidden dissatisfaction. Colonel Pembroke, for all his genial manners, had been a man of means and firm opinions. His will, it emerged under discreet coup. Estioning had been revised only a month earlier. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Lavender, who mentioned it tearfully, as though by accident. The Colonel, she said, had been concerned about fairness and responsibility. He had reduced certain allowances, encouraged others to become more self-sufficient. Basil Grant's name surfaced almost immediately in that context. His visits had grown more frequent, his requests more vague. The Colonel had refused him outright just days before Christmas, advising him to find proper employment. Basil's charm, so lightly worn, concealed desperation. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze lingered on the Colonel's writing desk, how he hovered when the subject of money arose, always ready with a joke to deflect discomfort. Then there was Mrs. Lavender herself, whose dependence on her brother had become a way of life. The thought of independence frightened her profoundly. Miss Marple remembered similar women in her youth, their fragility both genuine and convenient. A reduction in income would not merely inconvenience Mrs. Lavender, it would unmoor her entirely. Mrs. Hargreaves's motive was less obvious but no less real. She prided herself on her baking, on her place within the quiet hierarchy of St. Aldwyn's Close. Miss Marple recalled a recent church fete where Colonel Pembroke had praised another woman's pies as superior. A small thing, perhaps, but small slights could ferment into something bitter, especially when paired with an opportunity to demonstrate generosity. And Mrs. Pollock, efficient, loyal Mrs. Pollock, had served the Colonel for years. She had been with him through illness and recovery, had managed his household with calm authority, yet loyalty could curdle when it went unnoticed. Miss Marple learned, quietly, that the Colonel had recently informed her of his intention to reduce staff after the new year, suggesting she might slow down. A kind suggestion, perhaps, but one that threatened her livelihood and her sense of purpose. Each motive alone seemed insufficient. Together, they formed a dense tangle, each thread crossing another, obscuring the central pattern. Miss Marple turned her attention back to alibis, noting how neatly they overlapped without quite aligning. Mrs. Lavender's rest in her room, Basil's presence in the sitting-room, Mrs. Hargreaves's departure shortly after tea, Mrs. Pollock's constant movement between rooms, each had opportunity, yet none could be placed conclusively at the moment the poison was administered. It was the poison itself that troubled Miss Marple most. Poison required preparation, secrecy, and a certain knowledge. It was not something one stumbled upon in a fit of anger. It had to be introduced subtly, invisibly. A mince pie, festive and familiar, was an inspired choice, shared, trusted, and rarely questioned, but only one pie had been fatal. Miss Marple considered the pin mark again, that narrow indentation so easily overlooked. It suggested not a poisoned batch, but a poisoned portion. Someone had introduced the toxin after baking, after arrival, perhaps even after serving. That narrowed the field considerably. Inspector Slack returned, his expression thoughtful. "The lab confirms cyanide," he said quietly. "Small amount, carefully placed. And here's something else, the tin Mrs. Hargreaves brought. It was wiped clean inside. Too clean." Miss Marple nodded. "So the tin is a red herring. The pie was altered later, meaning someone had access after tea was served." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and enough confidence to know which pie would be eaten." They stood in silence for a moment, the pieces shifting subtly into new positions. Miss Marple felt the maze beginning to resolve, not into a single path, but into a narrowing corridor. Motive alone would not reveal the truth. It would require understanding habit, trust, and the quiet assumptions people made about one another. Somewhere in that house someone had relied on being overlooked, on kindness being mistaken for harmlessness, on routine masking intention, and Miss Marple was quite certain now that when the final thread was pulled, the entire web would give way at once. By late afternoon, a flurry of activity swept through number 4 St. Aldwyn's Close. Inspector Slack had summoned a team to re-examine the pies and the tin, his notebook filling with hurried notes and scribbled observations. The laboratory report had delivered what seemed a decisive lead. Traces of cyanide were found not only in the mince pie eaten by Colonel Pembroke, but also on a small sewing pin retrieved from the basket in Mrs. Pollock's room. The pieces seemed to align perfectly. Mrs. Pollock, by virtue of her proximity and the pin's origin, appeared to have the clearest opportunity. Slack moved swiftly, questioning her again with renewed intensity. "Mrs. Pollock," he said, voice edged with authority, "we now know the pin contained the poison. You handled it. You served the pie. You had motive, as Miss Marple herself noted. There's no way around it." Mrs. Pollock's face drained of colour. Her hands trembled, clutching her apron as if it could hold her together. I don't understand," she stammered. "I would never harm the Colonel. That pin, perhaps it was dropped. I didn't touch it in the kitchen. I simply tidied the basket." Inspector Slack shook his head with a self-satisfied air. "Sometimes, Mrs. Pollock, tidying is all it takes. We'll need to detain you until the case is closed." The household erupted into whispers and murmurs. Mrs. Lavender gasped, Basil Grant's mouth twitched in uncertain smiles, and Mrs. Hargreaves seemed almost relieved that the truth had emerged. The case AP. Peered solved. The criminal caught. The household's grief finally given an object upon which to focus its outrage. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair by the window, knitting forgotten on her lap. Her fingers tapped lightly against the needles as her mind worked, silently sifting through every detail. The pin, yes, was a convenient clue, but too convenient. It had appeared almost perfectly timed for discovery. It aligned neatly with the assumptions about Mrs. Pollock, and yet something did not fit. She thought of Mrs. Pollock's composure, her efficiency, the way she had anticipated the Colonel's needs for years. She had watched her throughout the morning, noting the subtle consistencies in her manner, the absence of hesitation except when forced under questioning. And most of all she remembered the subtle smudge on the pie saucer, the faint indentation that had first caught her attention. A tidy pin left in a basket could hardly explain the narrow mark on the pastry. Miss Marple also considered the distribution of the pies. Only one was poisoned. Only the Colonel had eaten it. Every other pie remained untouched, yet the other pies had been handled in the same environment, by the same people. Why then had the poison affected only one? Could it really have been as simple as a pin from a basket? The logic seemed too linear, too neat. Real crimes, she knew, rarely allowed themselves to be solved so tidily. Slack emerged from his brief conference with the team, beaming. "Case closed, Miss Marple. It's as I suspected. The pin, the opportunity, the motive, everything points to Mrs. Pollock." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes following him as he returned to the household to deliver the news. "Yes, Inspector," she said softly. "It does appear convincing to everyone else." Later, as the house settled once more, Miss Marple moved to examine the sitting room again. "Shh!" He knelt by the side table, observing the remains of the pie, the faint dusting of sugar, the invisible trail of intention. Something about the sequence felt choreographed, too deliberate in its misdirection. Whoever had done this had relied upon assumptions, the habitual trust in Mrs. Pollock, the expectation that only someone near the basket could have committed the act. The real criminal, Miss Marple realized, was still in the shadows, watching as the household collectively exhaled in relief. They had been led to a conclusion that satisfied the surface logic of motive and opportunity, but beneath it, the subtle strands of careful planning remained. The murderer had chosen a path that would divert attention, providing an escape hidden behind plausibility. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes moving over each person in the room. She sensed it now, faint and almost imperceptible, the quiet confidence of someone who believed themselves invisible, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the work is already done, that all eyes are elsewhere. The game was far from over, and the true resolution lay in noticing the patterns others refused to see. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the street gleaming with the cold clarity of winter light. Inside number 4, the household believed, the crisis resolved. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth. The victory celebrated so openly was false, and the real culprit had only begun to watch, waiting for the right moment to strike again, or to ensure that their deception remained unchallenged. Miss Marple spent the next few hours quietly observing the household, noting the subtle tensions that persisted even after the supposed resolution. Mrs. Pollock, outwardly relieved at being cleared of suspicion, moved about with a restrained grace, yet there was a quiet tension to her steps, as though she sensed the detective's eyes following her. Basil Gran. Tea lingered near the window, pretending interest in the falling snow, while Mrs. Lavender alternated between busying herself with trivial tasks and casting anxious glances at everyone around her. And Mrs. Hargreaves, for all her insistence on innocence, seemed almost too content that the focus had shifted away from herself. It was while Miss Marple examined the blue tin, now resting on the sideboard, that her thoughts began to drift backward. She traced the edges with her fingers, noting the dented corner she remembered from a previous village fete. And then a memory surfaced, faint, delicate, like a whisper from years ago. She recalled a case that had once stirred the quiet lanes of St. Aldwyn's Close, a minor but unsettling incident involving the theft of a family heirloom during a Christmas gathering. The culprit had never been found, and the case had been quietly shelved after a few days of fruitless inquiry. The stolen item had been returned anonymously weeks later, leaving the original suspicion unchallenged. Miss Marple's keen mind began to connect threads: the household, the proximity of the suspects, the small flourishes of opportunity. All of it resonated with the old incident. She remembered that Mrs. Hargreaves had been present then as a young woman, and that there had been talk, albeit hushed, of her being overly ambitious and envious of the family's more established members. The recollection was subtle, easily dismissed at the time, but now it cast her in a new light. She considered Basil Grant next. He had been a minor player in that past incident as well, a distant cousin who had lingered at the edges of family gatherings, eager to ingratiate himself with anyone who might advance his fortunes. That had been his pattern then: charm, attentiveness, and a careful avoidance of direct responsibility. And Mrs. Lavender's faint airs of fragility now seemed to Miss Marple reminiscent of someone used to being shielded by circumstance, a reliance cultivated over many years of habit rather than necessity. The pattern formed gradually like frost creeping along a window pane. The current tragedy, the poisoned mince pie, was not merely the result of an isolated grudge or sudden impulse. It was rooted in a long history of small slights, quiet resentments, and unmet expectations, all simmering beneath the polite veneer of village life. The suspects were linked in ways no one had yet recognized: shared histories, old jealousies, and the subtle competition for influence and inheritance within the extended family. Miss Marple's attention returned to the detail that had first troubled her: the narrow mark in the pie crumbs. She realized now that it was not only a clue to the method of poisoning, but also a symbol of the deliberate precision with which the act had been planned. The perpetrator understood the household, understood habits and expectations, and relied on years of subtle observation to execute the crime. And then there was the tin itself. Its peculiar choice, the unusually clean interior, and the absence of tampering pointed towards someone who knew both the past and the present intimately. The item had been a prop in earlier mischief, and now it had become part of a lethal plan. Miss Marple felt the web tighten in her mind. The past was no longer past. It was a living, active influence, guiding decisions, shaping resentments, and determining opportunity. Those who had seemed innocent were bound by memories of old incidents, and those incidents now provided the hidden keys to understanding the crime. As the late afternoon sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window. She gazed out at the quiet street, listening to the faint crunch of snow under distant footsteps. In that house someone was relying on the past being forgotten, on histories buried and overlooked. But Miss Marple knew better. The past had a way of asserting itself, of revealing connections when least expected, and in St. Aldwyn's Close, she was certain that those connections would soon illuminate the path to the true culprit. Miss Marple spent the evening in quiet contemplation, the house settling into a subdued hush as the daylight waned. While the others retired or busied themselves with small domestic routines, she moved among them, knitting forgotten, eyes sharp and unblinking. She had considered the web of motives, the echoes of the past, and now she needed something more, a clue that would not be found in statements or fingerprints, but in the reactions of the people themselves. It was with that thought that she conceived a subtle test. She requested that the remaining tin of mince pies be brought forward once more, along with the small, ordinary sewing basket that had been the ostensible source of suspicion. Then, as casually as one might discuss the weather, she spoke aloud, addressing the household at large. "Such a shame, isn't it," she said softly, "that the Colonel only sampled one pie. So many others left untouched. One wonders how carefully the pies were watched." She let her words hang in the air, allowing them to drift through the room. Mrs. Hargreaves tightened her grip on her handbag. Basil Grant straightened as if bracing himself against invisible scrutiny. Mrs. Lavender paled, and Mrs. Pollock's calm hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work with meticulous care. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The effect was subtle, but it was there. The tiniest tension, a flicker of unease in the eye, a slight tightening of lips. Gestures that revealed more than words ever could. She picked up the tin, fingering the dented edge, and spoke again, addressing no one in particular. "I always marvel at how objects carry history. A tin, a basket, even a simple pin. They tell stories if you know how to read them, sometimes more than the people who handle them." It was then that Basil Grant shifted, just a little too suddenly. His hand hovered near the sideboard as though to steady himself, but he caught it just in time, pressing it against his leg. Miss Marple's gaze followed the motion, noting the slight tremor in his fingers. She continued in the same gentle tone, allowing the conversation to seem casual. "Curious," she said, lifting the tin slightly, "how one item can appear ordinary to some eyes yet betray the most unusual events. One could almost imagine that certain individuals might have known exactly how to manipulate the objects in a room to give the wrong impression." Basil's eyes darted, the faintest tightening of the jaw betraying anxiety. Miss Marple's lips curved in a quiet smile. She had no need to accuse. The reaction alone was informative. While everyone else continued their polite attention, pretending disinterest, he had revealed the smallest crack in his carefully constructed demeanour. She placed the tin and basket back on the table, continuing her quiet observation. "Of course," she added, "the cleverest plan often relies on predictability, the assumption that people will only see what they expect, not what is hidden in plain sight." Her words, light as they seemed, had the effect she intended. Basil shifted again, once, twice, subtly, each movement a minor confession of unease. Miss Marple noted how he glanced at the pie crumbs on the side table, then at the basket, as though measuring his chances of slipping unnoticed through the mesh of scrutiny. The awareness of being watched, the careful attention to subtle psychological cues, was the very thing he had failed to anticipate. Mrs. Lavender began to wring her hands nervously, but in a controlled, habitual way that betrayed nothing. Mrs. Hargreaves' expression was composed, almost too composed, and Mrs. Pollock, as always, was a model of poised efficiency. Only Basil showed the telltale flutter of unease that indicated a concealed involvement, a subtle acknowledgement of guilt hidden beneath practised charm. Miss Marple leaned back, letting her eyes sweep the room one final time. She said nothing more, but in that silence the truth began to crystallize. The unconventional tactic, a gentle suggestive probing of character and reaction, had revealed the hidden fracture. The murderer's mask had been worn carefully, but no mask is perfect, and the smallest tremor can betray the intent behind it. As the evening deepened and shadows stretched across the floor, Miss Marple felt the final pieces beginning to align. The crime, long obscured by assumption and misdirection, was slowly yielding to observation, memory, and subtle psychological insight. One more careful move, and the full picture, long shrouded in the polite facades of St. Aldwyn's Close, would emerge into the cold clarity of truth. The following morning the house seemed smaller, tighter, almost conspiratorial. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind awake, long before anyone else, considering the reactions of the previous evening. She paced quietly through the sitting room, pausing by the sideboard where the blue tin and the remaining mince pies had been left under polite supervision. A faint sense of unease had settled over her. Though she had glimpsed the cracks in Basil Grant's composure, the case still required something more tangible, proof that would link him conclusively to the act. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after 8, carrying a small evidence bag that held the pin removed from the basket. "We're sending this straight to the lab for verification," he said, placing it carefully on the side table. "Once we have results, it'll settle everything." Miss Marple bent down, observing the pin through her magnifying glass. There was something unusually clean about it, as if handled with excessive care. She made a mental note, but said nothing. The others in the room were restless. Basil lingered near the fireplace, Mrs. Lavender fussed with napkins, and Mrs. Hargreaves cast brief, calculating glances at everyone. But when Inspector Slack returned from a quick phone call, the room shifted into sudden tension. He held his hand up, startled. "The bag. It's gone." A silence fell. Miss Marple's eyes lifted slowly, her sharp mind already tracing the implications. "Gone?" she repeated almost calmly, though a chill ran down her spine. "Yes," Slack said. "The evidence bag, the pin, all of it. I left it here for a moment to take a call, and now it's vanished." Mrs. Lavender clutched her shawl tightly. "Stolen? Could someone have come in? But the door was locked." "That's just it," Slack muttered, his irritation barely restrained. "No one could have entered without a key. And everyone in this room. It had to be one of us." Miss Marple moved closer to the side table, kneeling to examine the surface. There were no signs of Stiar. Uggle. No marks, no footprints in the snow tracked inside, no displaced items. Yet the bag was gone, and with it, a single most crucial piece of evidence linking the pie to the apparent method of murder. Her gaze fell on Basil Grant. He had been standing closest to the table, his posture just slightly more tense than before. He looked at her, forcing a casual smile that did not reach his eyes. I didn't touch it," he stammered. "Of course," Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost conversational. "But you did notice it, did you not? The bag, the pin, the proof of what happened. Such things draw attention, especially if one is invested in maintaining appearances." Basil's hand trembled imperceptibly. Brushing against the back of a chair, he averted his gaze. Mrs. Hargreaves shifted, suddenly attentive. "Perhaps it fell behind something," she suggested, though her eyes flickered to Basil in a way that betrayed more curiosity than innocence. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, it did not fall. It was deliberately removed. Someone wanted to make sure that the investigation could not proceed smoothly." Inspector Slack clenched his fists. "This changes everything. Whoever did this is working against us, probably hoping to buy time, hoping that confusion will cover guilt. The case is more dangerous than we realized." The household grew uneasy, whispers filling corners of the room. Each person seemed to glance at the others with new suspicion, their previously polite facades cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Trust became a fragile thing, easily broken. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly observant. The theft was no random act. It had been carried out with knowledge of the evidence, of procedure, and of the brief moment when the bag had been unattended. It required access, timing, and, most importantly, confidence in the assumption that no one would notice. She considered the room. The pin had vanished while everyone was present, leaving only subtle traces of intent. The hand that took it had to be familiar with the household's rhythms, aware of who would be watching and who could be distracted. Miss Marple's mind traced the possibilities, narrowing them with the precision of her knitting. Somewhere in that house, someone had chosen to interfere, to obstruct the course of justice, knowing exactly how far they could push without immediate detection. The stakes had risen sharply. What had once been a crime of opportunity was now layered with deliberate obstruction, designed to conceal guilt. Miss Marple rose from the table, eyes sweeping over the tense group. "Very well," she said softly, almost to herself. "If the evidence vanishes, we must look for evidence of the evidence. Those who act to hide the truth often leave traces more subtle than a bag or a pin, and it is those traces, however faint, that will reveal them." As she spoke, Basil Grant shifted again, a slight pallor across his face. Miss Marple's gaze lingered, recognizing once more that in trying to bury the truth, the real culprit had revealed far more than they realized. The tension in number 4 St. Aldwyn's Close was nearly tangible, a fine electric strain that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Miss Marple had been pacing slowly near the window, noting the patterns of light on the snow and the subtle movements of the household, when a sudden, sharp cry cut through the air. It came from the kitchen, short and startled, followed by the metallic crash of falling utensils. Everyone froze. Basil Grant's head snapped toward the sound, his face paling. Mrs. Lavender's hands flew to her mouth. Mrs. Hargreaves darted forward, muttering nervously about the Colonel, though she knew he was already gone. Miss Marple, calm but alert, moved toward the kitchen with steady steps, her mind racing through the implications. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Mrs. Pollock had collapsed near the counter, eyes wide, a broken saucepan at her feet. She was alive, but shaken, her hands clutching her chest as though to still a sudden, violent shock. The kitchen table, normally neat and orderly, had been overturned. But it was not the disarray that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the small, folded scrap of paper pinned beneath a saucepan. A hastily scribbled note, almost illegible, bore a single chilling message: "Stop digging, or next time it will be permanent." Inspector Slack arrived moments later, followed by 2 constables, but even his brisk authority faltered. "Someone's threatening the household," he said grimly. "They're still here, still watching." Miss Marple bent to examine the note, her eyes narrowing. The handwriting was deliberate but disguised, the strokes practiced, the letters unnervingly uniform. Whoever had done this knew the household intimately, knew the routines, and knew how to provoke fear without immediate detection. Basil Grant had stepped forward, nervously rubbing his hands together. It's gone too far," he said, voice unsteady. "Who would do this? Who would—" Miss Marple held up a finger, cutting him off softly but firmly. "Calm yourself. It is precisely because they are clever and because they have confidence that we must observe carefully. The individual who wrote this note is relying upon panic to cover their movements." She glanced around the room, noting details that others might overlook. A small smear of flour on the windowsill, a chair slightly angled away from the table, and the faint trace of a footprint in the snow just visible outside the open kitchen door. It suggested a rapid exit, a calculated disturbance designed to frighten rather than harm, yet still demonstrating the perpetrator's continued presence and boldness. "Miss Marple," Slack said, frustration edging his tone, "this changes everything. If they are willing to attack someone, even leave a threat in plain view, we're no longer just investigating a past murder. We're dealing with someone who can strike at any moment." "Exactly," she agreed. "And that is why we must think in steps ahead, not merely follow the trail behind us. Whoever is behind this understands the limits of suspicion, knows which paths the investigation will likely take. That knowledge gives them a dangerous advantage." Mrs. Pollock, still pale but steadier now, shook her head. I didn't touch anything," she whispered. "I was only moving the saucepan for cleaning, I swear." Miss Marple inclined her head, observing the quiet truth in the housekeeper's stance. Her composure, though rattled, was genuine. It was a performance of shock, not guilt. Outside, the snow had begun to thaw under a weak winter sun, but inside the house, fear had thickened, weaving itself into every glance and hesitant step. The note, the chaos, the threat, it was all a declaration. The murderer was still several steps ahead, confident, cunning, and willing to escalate. Miss Marple considered the implications carefully. The second act of aggression was not merely a warning, it was a test, designed to see who would falter, who would react, and who would make a mistake. The game had changed. No longer was it simply a matter of discovering who had poisoned a mince pie. Now, preventing another act, protecting the household from an invisible predator, had become urgent. She looked around at the household, at the trembling hands, the nervous shifting of weight, the quickened breaths, and she knew that patience alone would not suffice. The perpetrator relied on distraction, misdirection, and fear. To confront them, she would have to anticipate the next move, reading not just evidence, but character, instinct, and hesitation. Miss Marple folded her hands, her eyes calm, but her mind raced. The stakes had risen sharply, and every second now mattered. Somewhere in the house, or just beyond its walls, the real criminal waited, confident in their unseen control. But Miss Marple, as always, had patience, observation, and subtle cunning on her side. And in time, she knew, the true pattern would reveal itself, no matter how carefully it had been hidden. The house remained tense for hours after the kitchen incident, each occupant moving with exaggerated care, as if the walls themselves might betray them. Miss Marple, however, did not flinch. She sat quietly by the window, knitting abandoned once again, eyes drifting over the familiar angles of the room, tracing invisible lines of movement and behaviour. The second act of aggression had clarified one thing. The culprit was calculating, precise, and relied on the household's expectations of normalcy to mask their actions. It was in the quiet moments, when the others busied themselves with trifles to distract from fear, that Miss Marple noticed what had eluded everyone else. A simple, almost laughable detail, a tiny smudge of sugar on the rim of the teacup Basil Grant had been using, caught her attention. At first, she dismissed it, thinking it nothing more than a careless spill. But as her mind replayed the morning, she remembered how the cup had been set aside precisely at the time when the evidence bag disappeared. The sugar had not come from his breakfast. It was the same granulated sugar used in the pies. Her eyes followed the faint trail, noting that it led not from the sideboard or the kitchen, but toward the small hallway that connected the sitting room to the servants' quarters. A subtle pattern began to emerge, connecting moments, movements, and objects that had seemed random. The stolen evidence, the pin, the pie, each acted as a node, and the tiny overlooked sugar smudge became the thread linking them. Miss Marple's thoughts turned next to the behaviour of the suspects. Basil's reactions yesterday, the tightening of his jaw, the restless shifting of his hands, the fleeting glance at the pie crumbs, were no longer isolated incidents. Paired with the small physical evidence she now recognized, they formed a sequence, proximity, opportunity, and a subtle marking of intent. Someone had moved through the house with a calm and deliberate precision, using the habits and assumptions of others to cloak their movements. She considered Mrs. Hargreaves, who had insisted on her innocence so vocally. Her composure seemed too controlled, almost rehearsed. The old incident at the church fete, the subtle envy of household recognition, and her knowledge of the tin's peculiarities could easily explain a motive, but when compared to the physical evidence of sugar and the sequence of events surrounding the stolen pin, she did not fit the emerging pattern. Mrs. Lavender's fragility and Mrs. Pollock's poise were equally revealing, but for opposite reasons. Mrs. Pollock had been nearest the basket but had no opportunity to remove the pin without being observed. Mrs. Lavender had been confined to her room and had no access. By process of elimination, the small acts of carelessness and the subtle traces pointed increasingly toward one individual, Basil Grant. Miss Marple traced the invisible steps in her mind. The slight delay in his responses during questioning, the way he hovered near the sideboard while pretending to look at the fire, the nervous glance at the tin, the sugar smudge linking him physically to the pies. Even the note left in the kitchen could be accounted for, a planted threat meant to distract and mislead, exploiting the household's fear and the authorities' assumptions about proximity and loyalty. It all fit together with startling clarity. The genius of the plan lay not in elaborate trickery, but in the confidence of someone who believed the smallest habits could be relied upon to hide the largest crimes. Every subtle movement, every glance, every apparent misstep was part of a careful choreography intended to divert suspicion. Miss Marple rose, walking slowly around the room, letting her gaze fall on each suspect in turn. Her expression was mild, almost idle, but her mind was alight with the connections she had traced. A pattern, so subtle that no one else had noticed, now revealed the criminal's method, the exploitation of trust, the use of routine as camouflage, the reliance on fear and distraction to mask deliberate acts. She paused by the sideboard, resting a hand lightly on the blue tin. All along, the answer had been in plain sight, hidden in a collection of trivial details dismissed by everyone else. The thief of evidence, the manipulator of fear, the orchestrator of the poisoned mince pie and the stolen pin had left traces too small for the casual observer, but glaring to one who knew how to watch, to connect, to see meaning where others saw only chaos. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the understanding that the true culprit's confidence had been their undoing. What remained now was not merely to prove guilt, but to confront it before another subtle, invisible act could escalate into something irreversible. Miss Marple moved quietly through the house, her thoughts threading the connections she had observed, the traces of sugar, the displaced pin, the subtle gestures that had revealed so much. She paused by the window, watching the pale winter sun glinting off the snow, and considered Basil Grant. His motives had seemed simple enough at first: greed, the desire to reclaim favour with the Colonel, a habitual reliance on family resources. But as she examined the pattern of his behaviour, a darker, more intricate thread began to emerge. She recalled small details from the past few days, the way he lingered near the pies with an intensity that bordered on obsession, the brief flash of satisfaction when Mrs. Pollock was momentarily suspected, the precision with which he manipulated the sequence of events to misdirect the household. Each act had been calculated not merely to achieve a financial goal, but to assert control, to shape the environment according to his will. Miss Marple understood then that this was no ordinary desire for inheritance or simple ambition. It was a compulsion, a need to dominate, to manipulate, to prove cunning over those around him. Her thoughts drifted back to the old church fete incident. Basil had been a young man then, eager to impress, to maneuver for attention, yet always willing to exploit minor oversights and social expectations. Over the years, that behaviour had not vanished. It had only grown more precise, more deliberate. The poisoned pie, the stolen evidence, the planted note in the kitchen, all were manifestations of a psyche attuned to control and secrecy, an individual for whom deception was not only a tool, but a necessity of existence. Miss Marple examined the household once more. Mrs. Lavender's delicate dependence had been a shield, Mrs. Hargreaves' pride had been a foil, Mrs. Pollock's steadiness had been a sou, med as a guarantee of innocence. Basil had relied upon these assumptions, confident that routine and habit would mask his actions, but the slightest disruption, the sugar on the teacup, the flicker of hesitation under questioning, had exposed a pattern he believed invisible. She turned her attention back to the kitchen, imagining the moments when the poisoned pie had been set aside, the pin left for discovery, the calculated misdirection of the note. Each element reflected the same fundamental motive, not mere gain, but the assertion of control, the satisfaction of intellect over circumstance, and the gratification of manipulating others without their knowledge. It was a motive that few could recognize, let alone anticipate, because it was psychological, subtle, and deeply personal. Miss Marple called the household together, speaking gently yet with a gravity that commanded attention. "We have seen a series of events unfold," she began, each one carefully orchestrated, each small act serving a purpose. "But the reason behind them is not only desire or anger, it is something deeper. The person responsible craves the mastery of others' perceptions, the ability to shape fear and uncertainty without revealing themselves. That need has guided every action, every misdirection, every attempt to evade suspicion." Basil Grant shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. His attempts to appear casual, to mask the tightness in his expression, were futile against the steady insight Miss Marple displayed. "The crime," she continued, "was never simply about wealth or inheritance. It was about proving cleverness, about asserting control over a household that trusted one another and assumed honesty. The poison, the stolen evidence, and the note in the kitchen were all instruments, means of exercising that control, of demonstrating power over fear and perception. It is a motive more subtle yet, far more dangerous than simple greed, and that is why it has taken careful observation to see it." Basil's lips parted slightly, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps recognition, passing across his face. Miss Marple noted it without hesitation, the awareness that he had been seen, understood, and rendered vulnerable. The others in the room exchanged nervous glances, understanding now that the act had been psychological as much as physical. Fear had been weaponized, trust exploited, and routine manipulated. Miss Marple's revelation brought the hidden motive into sharp relief, exposing a truth that was unsettling precisely because it was invisible to casual observation, a mind driven not by circumstance, but by the compulsion to dominate the lives of those around it. She paused, letting her words settle like a winter hush over the room. "And now," she said softly, "we know why it was done, and why it was so meticulously concealed. Understanding the motive allows us to anticipate the next steps, to see the unseen, and to prevent further harm." Basil Grant remained silent, yet the tension radiating from him spoke volumes. The hidden motive had been revealed, and with it the path to confronting the true extent of his deception lay open before Miss Marple. The crime was no longer merely an act to be solved, It was a psychological puzzle, and the pieces had finally begun to fall into place. Miss Marple moved through the house with quiet certainty, the rhythm of her steps deliberate and measured. The day had grown grey outside, clouds heavy with unshed snow, and the household had been gathered in the sitting-room under the pretence of calm discussion. But the detective's mind was focused, threading together the intricate web she had been observing for days. Every detail, every hesitation, every subtle mark had led her here, and she now had the confidence to act. She settled hers, LF in her favourite chair, knitting needles idle in her lap, and allowed her gaze to rest on Basil Grant. He stood near the fireplace trying to appear at ease, though the tremor in his hands betrayed the anxiety she had anticipated. The previous revelations about his hidden motive, the psychological need for control, the meticulous orchestration of fear, and the subtle manipulation of evidence had cornered him in ways that wealth, charm, or self-assurance could no longer mask. "Basil," she said softly, her voice calm and measured, "I believe you understand by now that I have observed more than anyone suspected. The sequence of events, the stolen evidence, the poisoned pie, all of it forms a pattern, and that pattern leads directly to you." He laughed nervously, a short, brittle sound that did nothing to disguise the tension in his posture. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a casual shrug, "you're reading far too much into this. It was all coincidence. Surely anyone could have—" "Coincidence," she interrupted gently, "rarely explains the precision of timing, the sequence of opportunity, and the careful diversion of suspicion. The sugar on the teacup, the alignment of movements, the note in the kitchen, they were not mistakes, Basil. They were calculated acts intended to create fear, to mislead and to conceal your involvement." He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the window as though considering a sudden flight. Miss Marple's gaze followed him, unyielding, but her expression remained serene. She had allowed the moment to build, knowing that the pressure of recognition would cause the fracture she anticipated. "You see," she continued, "every step you took was predictable to someone who watched carefully. Your need to dominate, to manipulate, has left a trail. The crime was never about money alone. It was about control, about asserting intellect and power over those who rusted you. And the more clever you thought yourself, the more evident the pattern became." Basil's hands twitched, and his composure cracked further. You can't prove anything," he exclaimed, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple rose slowly, approaching him with a calm authority. "I need no confession to see the truth. It has been in plain sight all along, but if you speak now, you may ease the burden you have carried alone and spare the household from further fear." For a long moment Basil stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing down like the dense winter air outside. Then, as if the walls themselves closed in, he sagged, his bravado crumbling. It wasn't meant to go that far," he admitted, voice low and strained. "I only wanted to prove I could manage it, that I could control the outcome. I never intended anyone to be hurt." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Intent and outcome often diverge, Basil. What you believed was a test of cunning became a tragic lesson in human consequence. But now, recognizing that, you may do what is necessary to correct what has been done." He sank into a nearby chair, defeated, the mask of charm and confidence completely shattered. Inspector Slack stepped forward, quietly observing the scene, ready to act. Miss Marple, composed as ever, allowed the natural momentum of confession and acknowledgement to unfold, knowing that the psychological weight of exposure was the final instrument needed. Basil's eyes, once sharp and calculating, now reflected a mixture of fear, shame, and reluctant clarity. "It was the pies," he whispered. I poisoned one of them. I wanted to create a diversion, to test reactions. And the pin His words faltered, incomplete, yet the truth had begun to surface in the tremor of his hands and the downcast gaze. Miss Marple's voice remained soft but steady. "You have admitted what the evidence and observation already made clear. The rest, your choices, your actions, your conscience, must follow naturally." Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to drift silently onto the street, blanketing the village in quiet white. Inside number 4, the tension that had gripped the household for days began to ease, replaced by the sobering weight of revelation, the crime, the pattern, the hidden motive, all had converged in this moment of confrontation. Miss Marple returned to her chair, knitting needles poised once again. The final confrontation had revealed the heart of the matter, and the pieces were in place. Justice, though delayed, could now follow its proper course, guided by patience, observation, and the subtle yet unerring insight that had led to this very moment. The house had finally begun to breathe again, the tension easing as Basil Grant's confession settled over the room. The servants and relatives moved with cautious relief, whispering reassurances to one another, and Inspector Slack, though still vigilant, allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. Miss Marple, however, did not relax. She continued to observe quietly, her sharp mind tracing the threads of the crime, scanning the reactions of each household member with a patience born of long experience. Even in confession, there was always the possibility of hidden layers, and Miss Marple's instincts were rarely wrong. As she glanced toward the sideboard, her eyes fell on the blue tin. It had been examined repeatedly, moved and replaced, yet something about it seemed unresolved. She stepped closer, fingers tracing the edge once again, and noticed a faint impression on the metal, a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch near the hinge. It was inconsistent with any handling by Basil, too precise to be accidental. Her gaze swept the room, noting Mrs. Hargreaves' posture. For the first time, a flicker of unease crossed the usually composed woman's face, so subtle that only Miss Marple's practised eye could detect it. The memo. Rye of the Church fate incident resurfaced. Mrs. Hargreaves had been nearby whenever Basil had attempted minor schemes in the past, always vigilant, always calculating. Could she have been watching, manipulating, guiding him even then? Miss Marple's mind began to connect overlooked moments, the sudden, staged chaos in the kitchen, the ease with which the pin disappeared, the precise timing of the threatening note. Basil had been clever, yes, but the execution of the plan required foreknowledge that seemed beyond his capabilities. The psychological need for control explained his motive, yet not the flawless orchestration of distraction. She called the household together once more, speaking with calm authority. "I believe we have understood much about yesterday's events," she said, voice soft but compelling, "and we have seen the confession of one who acted out of impulse, curiosity, and the desire to assert control. But one question remains. How did the act reach such a level of precision? Who guided the sequence, ensuring that the evidence would mislead and the fear would escalate?" Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened, but before anyone could respond, Miss Marple continued. "Basil was an instrument, not entirely the composer. The real mastermind is someone who understood the household's habits, who knew how each individual would respond under pressure, and who could manipulate even the most subtle opportunities to their advantage. They were patient, observing, and daring enough to act indirectly while remaining unseen." A faint gasp rippled through the room. Basil's eyes widened, and for the first time a shadow of fear crossed his face that no amount of composure could hide. Mrs. Hargreaves, caught in the quiet intensity of Miss Marple's gaze, faltered ever so slightly. "The final clue," Miss Marple said, lifting the blue tin, "was always here. Notice the faint scratch near the hinge, a mark too deliberate to be mere accident. It suggests manipulation, preparation, and foresight. Combined with the pattern of the threats, the theft, and the orchestration of fear, it points not merely to one impulsive actor, but to a guiding hand, one who ensured the events unfolded with both precision and misdirection." The room was silent, tension coiling like a spring. Mrs. Hargreaves's face paled as her carefully maintained composure threatened to crumble. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice wavering. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unyielding. "You observed, you guided, and you ensured that Basil's impulses carried out your plan without revealing your own hand. Every hesitation, every distraction, every misdirected glance, these were orchestrated under your quiet supervision. Your motive was not only to watch, but to prove that you could control both events and the perception of those events." Basil stumbled back, eyes darting between Miss Marple and Mrs. Hargreaves, realization dawning. "You set me up?" he stammered. Mrs. Hargreaves' lips parted, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with the faintest flicker of acknowledgement, before collapsing into startled, guilty silence. The confession, unspoken but palpable, filled the room like the chill of the winter air drifting through the windows. Miss Marple's voice, calm and precise, concluded the revelation. It was a partnership of psychology and subtle guidance. Basil executed the act, but you, quietly, unseen, ensured the precision, the misdirection, and the drama. The real mastermind is now revealed, and the case, though long and intricate, is complete. The household held its collective breath, the weight of the last-minute twist settling in. The crime, it seemed, had been far more complex than any outward appearance suggested, a web of manipulation and psychological control that had taken all of Miss Marple's insight to unravel. Yet, as the truth lay bare, the pieces finally fit into place, and the final elusive threads of the mystery were now visible for all to see. The room remained thick with tension, the last threads of the mystery unraveling but leaving a chill in their wake. Basil Grant slumped into a chair, the weight of exposure pressing heavily on him, while Mrs. Hargreaves' composed exterior had entirely given way to a quiet, restrained panic. Inspector Slack moved forward, finally able to assert authority, and quietly signalled to 2 constables to place Basil under watch. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Mrs. Hargreaves, sharp and unrelenting. "Miss Marple," Slack said, with Basil's confession, "the matter is settled. He admits the poisoning, the theft of evidence, even the manipulation. Isn't that sufficient?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Sufficient for some, perhaps. But there is one final consideration. The hand that guided the events, the mind that orchestrated, the psychological thread of the household. Confession alone does not always reveal the full story." She pointed toward the sideboard, at the faint scratch on the blue tin. This small mark, almost invisible to anyone else, was overlooked because it seemed insignificant. Yet it shows preparation, foresight, and manipulation, evidence that the act was guided. Basil carried out the deed, yes, but he was not entirely the architect. Mrs. Hargreaves's breathing became shallow, and her eyes darted toward the door as though plotting a final escape. Miss Marple's gaze was unyielding. "There is no need for concealment. The truth is clear, even to those who would prefer otherwise. You ensured the precision, guided the misdirections, and relied upon others' assumptions to shield your own hand. That is why the events unfolded with such flawless, if chilling, timing." For a moment, silence filled the room, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than any words. Basil muttered something incoherent, while Mrs. Hargreaves' lips tightened in defiance. Then, in a sudden, almost imperceptible movement, she made a dash toward the door, intent on fleeing. Miss Marple's reflexes were as calm as they were swift. "Inspector Slack," she called, and with practiced timing, 2 constables intercepted Mrs. Hargreaves, gently restraining her as she struggled. "Flight seldom conceals guilt," Miss Marple observed, "and it often reveals intent." Slack exhaled sharply, finally grasping the depth of the deception. "So she was the mastermind all along," he said, incredulity in his voice. "Basil was just a pawn?" "Exactly," Miss Marple confirmed. "He acted under the influence of her psychological design. She relied upon his impulses, the subtle tensions in the household, and the assumptions of those present to conceal her own hand. The poisoned pie, the stolen pin, the threatening note, they were all orchestrated to mislead. Yet a small detail, a scratch, a tremor, an overlooked trace, reveals the invisible hand behind the scenes." She walked slowly around the room, pointing out the overlooked signs, Basil's nervous adjustments, the sugar on the teacup leading to the sequence of events, the precise timing of the note in the kitchen, and, finally, the tin itself. Each element, minor on its own, forms a chain. Miss a single link, and the narrative appears chaotic and unsolvable. Observe carefully, and the pattern emerges with clarity. The constables secured Mrs. Hargreaves, and she finally slumped into a chair, eyes downcast, realizing that escape was no longer possible. Basil, still seated, cast a glance toward her, recognition of his unwitting role in her scheme heavy on his face. Miss Marple returned to her chair, knitting needles poised once more, the picture now fully resolved. In her mind. "The brilliance of detection," she said quietly, "lies not only in observing what is visible, but in noticing what is assumed invisible. Timing, behavior, minor imperfections, and human instinct, all of these speak to those who are patient and attentive." Inspector Slack exhaled, nodding. "Well, I suppose this proves it. You were one step ahead all along." Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "Not ahead, merely observant," she said. "The answers were always in plain sight, though few noticed them. Justice is served, yes, but it is the careful study of human nature that reveals it so completely." Outside, the village remained peaceful, snow drifting silently onto the street. Inside number 4, the household exhaled collectively, the tension easing at last. Yet, even as the criminals were contained, there lingered the delicate awareness that such intricate schemes could recur wherever observation falters, and that human cunning is rarely extinguished by a single revelation. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, knew that vigilance, patience, and understanding were always necessary companions to justice, even when the house seemed quiet and the snow had finally settled. The household had quieted at last. Basil sat under watchful eyes, subdued, while Mrs. Hargreaves had been escorted gently to her room, the weight of her guilt heavy upon her. Inspector Slack moved about, completing notes and securing statements, but even his brisk efficiency could not entirely dispel the lingering tension. Miss Marple, for her part, remained calm, knitting steadily in the sitting-room, though her mind continued to trace the delicate lines of cause and effect that had revealed the truth. The evening had settled into a fragile stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house, or the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Miss Marple rose, stretching slightly, and walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered street. The events of the past days, the poisoned pie, the stolen pin, the threatening note, the careful orchestration of fear, had all reached their resolution, yet the detective's mind remained alert, scanning for what might yet be hidden. Her gaze fell on a small detail she had almost dismissed before, a single footprint near the edge of the porch, half covered by fresh snow, distinct from any she had tracked earlier. Its impression was faint, incomplete, yet the shape suggested someone had been moving quietly, carefully, with purpose, someone she had not counted for in the full unravelling of events. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Even after the dramatic confessions and the resolution of Basil and Mrs. Hargreaves, a subtle reminder remained that human behaviour is rarely entirely predictable. She returned to her chair, placing her knitting aside for a moment, and considered the possibilities. The footprint might be insignificant. A passer-by, a neighbour, but its presence at this particular hour and location stirred her curiosity. Her eyes drifted to the other objects in the room, the blue tin now firmly closed, the sideboard neatly restored, the faint sugar smudge on the teacup, already fading under the warmth of the room. Everything appeared settled, yet her mind recognized the impermanence of appearances. Human cunning, she knew, could manifest in ways both small and subtle, leaving traces that might be overlooked by all but the most attentive observer. She glanced toward the hearth, where the last of the daylight glimmered faintly. Even as the household relaxed, she sensed that some minor detail had yet to fully reveal its meaning. Perhaps it was a clue that had been missed amid the larger drama, or perhaps a faint signal of a new scheme quietly unfolding in the shadows. The detective's instinct whispered that the story, while largely concluded, was not entirely closed. As she prepared to leave the house, nodding politely to Inspector Slack and the household staff, she allowed herself a small, secretive smile. The resolution had brought clarity, justice had been enacted, but the faintest ripple of uncertainty remained, an imperceptible shadow suggesting that another puzzle might one day demand attention. A note, a glance, a misaligned object, anything could be the spark for a new mystery, waiting patiently to be discovered. Walking out into the crisp evening air, Miss Marple drew her coat snugly around her. The snow crunched softly beneath her feet, each step deliberate and reflective. The village lay quiet, peaceful, yet she carried with her the knowledge that the nature of human behaviour was never fully transparent, that subtle deceptions could persist unseen, and that a keen eye must always remain vigilant. The distant chiming of a clock marked the passing hour, and for a moment the world seemed settled, serene. Yet Miss Marple knew, with her characteristic quiet certainty, that mysteries rarely end so completely. Somewhere, perhaps not far from the calm streets and snow-laden roofs, a detail waited to be uncovered, A story waited to unfold, and another puzzle, like the faint trace of a footprint, would eventually beckon her insight once more. She paused at the edge of the village, inhaling the crisp, cold air, then continued walking, her mind alert, her senses sharp. The case at number 4, St. Aldwyn's Close, was concluded, but the faint thrill of anticipation lingered. For Miss Marple, every resolved mystery was also an invitation to remain observant, to notice the small hidden truths, and to recognize that the world, with all its subtleties and secrets, never truly ceased to be mysterious. And so she disappeared into the soft veil of snow and twilight, a quiet figure moving forward, ever watchful, leaving behind a household restored, yet quietly aware that, with Miss Marple, no secret ever remains hidden for long.